Brethren, with everything that's going on right now, especially in the congregation and the things that we least expect, we cannot take life for granted. We cannot expect to even wake up the next day. Every single day is a blessing from God. So we ought not to devise our own plans in life. We know that Christ said, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow has its own worries. And I think for human beings in general, that's extremely hard for us to do, to listen to practice. To not worry about tomorrow is something that's not in our human nature, because we're always planning around what we want to do in the future. We're always thinking about the next time we're going to go out, have a good time. We're thinking about what kind of purchase you want to make next on anything that you might want in this world. And we can get caught up in that kind of thing. We can get caught up in our own human plans. We can get caught up in the grand scheme of humanity, which is just to do what thou wilt, which is, of course, a token from, I don't even like to say his name, but from the Church of Satan founder. But that's really the entire demise of the world. That's the phrasing of the world, which is do what thou wilt, which is instead of do for others as you would have them do unto you, instead the world thinks it's good to just do whatever you want to do as long as it hurts nobody. But we know that's the way of the enemy. That's the way of Satan. The way of get but not give. And I want to talk to you today about when God interrupts your plans. When God interrupts your plans. Because like I said, we go through life and we plan things out. We plan a year in advance. We plan months in advance, days in advance. And we don't realize that we need to relinquish our plans if we want God to do anything in our lives worth something. Because God's plans are greater than our own. And God's ways are higher than our own. And our plans are just fleshly, they're human, they're temporary, they don't last forever. They're inferior to the plans of God. Satan's always trying to get our focus on other things, trying to get us focused on our plans that revolve around the world, instead of looking for God to lead our lives, instead of letting God make our plans for us, letting God map out the route that we're taking. And a lot of times we seek the path of least resistance, but that's the path of corruption. That's the path of contentment. That's the path of destruction. That's not the straight and narrow that Christ says we should be on. So brethren, we need to stay on that straight path. The path of least resistance offers us an easy life. Offers us an easy life. God's not looking for us to have our best life now. He's looking for us to have our best life later on. Not right now. God does not promise us every good thing in the world. God does not promise the ease of life for a Christian. But He promises hardship. He promises mourning, sadness. But in the middle of all that, He also promises to be with us and lead us and protect us and get us through whatever we're going through. Satan tried to put Adam and Eve on this plan, the human kind of plan, instead of looking for God to lead. God tried to lead them in the beginning. He created Adam, then He created Eve out of the side of the man, named her Eve because she was taken out of man. And He gave them instructions. He tried to lead. He tried to plan things out for them. But as usual, the enemy jumped in and tried to make plans for them. Same way the enemy does that now. He implants thoughts into our minds to make other plans that are outside of God's own plans. Satan offers Adam and Eve power, the mind of God, the knowledge of good and evil. wisdom, the wisdom of God, that you can have everything that God has in his characteristics that you can have also. So he tried to put them on that plan, and they took the bait. And the rest of the world now thinks that they can make their own plans, and they think that their plans can thwart God's plan. But that's not the way. That's not the way it's going to happen. I want to look at a story today of a man that thought he was going to have his life go one way, and it went a completely different way. And that's the story of Joseph. And it starts in chapter 37 of Genesis. You can turn there. Chapter 37 of Genesis, in verse 1. Let's go to verse 3 of Genesis 37. Verse 3. Now Israel, remember Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other brothers, more than any of his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. Many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheep arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheep stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." Notice here that Jacob gives Joseph a coat of many colors. And in many ways, God gives his own children this cloak of many colors as well, because he favors us. So he puts on that coat of many colors on us, the radiance of all the colors of God. God is beautiful, right? And God's beauty is found in creation, and it's exhibited here physically in this tunic of many colors. And God's blessings are beautiful for our lives as well. So God favors us. He puts on this cloak on all his children, because not every single person out there is a child of God. They're created by God, but we know that there needs to be a certain right to be a child of God, according to John chapter 1. That we would have the right to become children of God to those who believe in his name, John chapter 1 says. So not everyone is a child of God, but rather created by God. So we have this opportunity to put on this cloak every single day of colors. And that cloak for Christians is the righteousness of Christ in us. And of course, his brothers get jealous of it, and the world gets jealous of us. They won't call it jealousy, because then they would be giving us some power that they think that they're giving us. But just the way the world works, brother. The world gets jealous. The world sees Christians and they persecute them. And it's just like Joseph's brothers, who saw that cloak of many colors, and they hated him even more. They didn't just hate him for what he said to them, the dreams that he dreamt, but the fact that there was now an outward expression of God's goodness on Joseph, and the favoritism that Jacob had for him, that jealousy there as well. And you see here that Joseph is having these dreams now, and I'm going to say to you today that it's okay to be a dreamer. It's okay to be a dreamer. What does that mean? It's okay to be a dreamer. Well, people just think that dreams are just all about, like, you go to sleep and you have a random dream and you're like, oh, I remember the dream. What's a dreamer? Well, Joseph had certain dreams that came from God, right? And I'm not saying everyone's going to have prophetic dreams or anything like that, but you can learn certain things from dreams, right? Has anyone ever had a dream that they learned something from, a lesson from? So God can work through dreams. It doesn't mean he's going to give you a prophetic word in a dream, but God can work through dreams. And the dreams that can come by us are daydreams even. Who daydreams about the kingdom? Anybody here ever think about the kingdom? That's daydreaming, right? Because what? That's coming in the future. That's going to come later on. That's a daydream. So people think that if you're a dreamer, it's automatically a negative thing, but it's not. And that's how the brothers here thought of it as, and maybe even Jacob. Verse 8, and his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So the world says the same thing to us. Oh, you're talking about this revelation that you're saints of God, that you're first fruits, right? Well, what are going to become of us? You're going to say that we're going to shout to the mountains and the hills and to the rocks to fall on us and hide us from the face of God? And that we're going to be destroyed if we don't comply to the way of God, to the government of God? So they say things that are very similar in the world to us. You think you're going to rule over us? Well, yeah, we're going to rule over the world as kings and priests of God. And we'll be teaching those people the way of God. Verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him. He said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in his mind. So it seems to be that, we do the same things. We can overreact when we hear something. So Jacob overreacts to this dream that Joseph has. And maybe a little bit of pride crept into Jacob. Jacob's like, I'm Israel. I wrestled with God. I've seen him manifested in the flesh for that moment. You're telling me I'm going to worship and bow down to you? He probably also took it as idolatrous. But Jacob obviously being reactive. We must try not to be reactive in this world. But then he later on probably realized his reactionary reaction. And he decided to put this away in his heart and to contemplate what it might have meant. Verse 12, and his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. Then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flocks. So we're going to move on a little bit here. Obviously, Joseph goes at the command of his father, and he goes to check on his brothers who are out tending the flocks. And the brothers say, look, here comes that dreamer. He's coming. What do you want to do with him? He's going to come and tell us another dream that's going to get us angry. A dream about him ruling over us one day. Verse 20 of chapter 37 reads, come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we will say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. So obviously here they're they're exhibiting a murderous spirit here to try to destroy Joseph. And much of the world is, if you can't beat it, destroy it. If you can't beat it, get it out of the way. And in this way, it was very literal, that they actually devised a way to first murder him, but then later we're going to see that they tried to get him out of their vicinity. They tried to just cast him away, get him far, far away, get him into a circumstance that he cannot escape and come back. So yeah, the world right now won't necessarily kill us, but they will treat us as dead people. They will treat us as if we're dead. Because if they acknowledge us, then they have to acknowledge the God who we serve. So they conspire amongst each other, and some of the brothers are divided. Some of them are saying, just kill him, get it over with. And then others are like, no, we can't kill him, he's our brother. That's wrong. And then they see men that are afar off from Egypt traders that take money for slaves, bringing a slave into a person into captivity, and that person selling them gets the money, obviously. So they, in the meantime, before that, they threw Joseph into a pit, and when they saw these men, they pulled him out and sold him into slavery. And this is very reminiscent of the story of Jesus. There's a lot of foreshadowings in the story of Joseph to the story of Jesus Christ. How Jesus Christ was sold, in a sense, for 30 pieces of silver, right? By his own people, by Israel. And in this story, he was sold by his own brothers. And of course, Jesus was taken from freedom into captivity. He was arrested by the chief priests and the religious leaders, and he did spend one night in a prison as well, in like a dark hole, the same way Joseph did, until he got his sentencing the next day of crucifixion. I want to move on now to chapter 39 of Genesis. Now, up to this point, Joseph was sold into slavery, and he was bought by a man named Potiphar. He's a powerful man in Egypt. He was an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian. And Potiphar sees some use in Joseph, so he puts him in charge of his household. And of course, we know the story of Potiphar's wife, who lusted after Joseph and gave a false testimony of what happened that day. Potiphar's wife obviously trying to grab Joseph, possibly rape Joseph or force him into doing something like that. And she uses her authority and her position over him. So obviously Joseph could have, outmuscled her. But when you're under a certain authority, and if you're a servant under somebody, you're afraid to do certain things or to go against certain people. And that's the very thing we must be careful about in the world as a Christian, is that the world will scare you into submission, right? It will try to force you to do things outside of your will. But we must not bend to their agendas, to Satan's agenda. In the same way, Potiphar's wife had certain authority over Joseph, but Joseph did not bend to her authority. But he relied on God's strength to get him through that pressure that he had in that moment. And we must consider that also Joseph must have been tempted as well as a man. We must keep that in mind. That temptation is out there as well. We could be tempted into the things of the world and the pressures of the world and the do this and don't do that of the world. And that's what Joseph had to deal with here. So of course she falsely accuses him of rape or trying to rape her. And he gets thrown into prison by Potiphar. So he loses the trust of Potiphar. He gets thrown into prison. And Joseph's forgotten in prison overall. He's in prison for many, many, many years. And then there's two men that come forward into the prison. One of them a baker and one of them a cupbearer. And they have dreams, just like Joseph was having dreams. And these dreams mean something. The one is a baker, and he has dreams about a basket on his head with bread in it. All a bunch of baked goods for the Pharaoh. And the birds come and they devour all the bread that's on his head. And Joseph interprets that dream that he will not get his position back, that he will be killed. He will be impaled on a stake. Impaled or hung. But the cupbearer's dream was one of pouring wine and fresh grapes into the cup of Pharaoh. And that was interpreted by Joseph to mean that he would be restored to his position of cupbearer of Pharaoh. So Joseph interpreted these dreams correctly, and word came back to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh was having a restless night, tossing and turning, and he had a dream about 7 fatted cows. And then he had another part of his dream was 7 skinny, gaunty, he uses the word gaunty cows. And the gaunty and the hungry cows ate the 7 healthy cows. And Joseph was able to interpret that dream. He called on his sorcerers, his wise men, and none of them can interpret this dream. But God, who is the revealer of dreams, he was able to reveal this dream to Joseph. And Joseph gives credit to God. He said, it's not I who interprets this dream for you, but it's God who tells you your dream, who tells you the meaning of your dream. So thus far, as we can see, Joseph in the beginning had plans to inherit all of his father's things. He was his father's favorite son. He was going to get his inheritance, his money, his goods, probably the next in control, because he was the favorite. But God comes in with a different plan. When God interrupts your plans, and that's what happened to Joseph. So Joseph, because he interpreted the Pharaoh's dream correctly, he was put as second in control of all of Egypt as a governor. I'm not going to try to announce the new name he was given. I think it's something like Balabar or Hashbad or something like that. So he gets a new name. And it's interesting because when we come into the kingdom, what does it say? We will get a new name, right? A new name written on what? A white stone. And nobody knows that name except for Christ. And so we will receive a new name when we come into the kingdom, just like Joseph here came into power. So Joseph told the Pharaoh his plans of the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, and he decided to store up grain for the 7 years of plenty to have enough food for the entire world for the 7 years of famine. And now we get into the story of Joseph and his brothers. His brothers come into Egypt because they're starving. They have no food. There's a famine in the land. Genesis chapter 45. Joseph goes into these charades with his brothers. They come in. He talks to these brothers. He finds out where they're from. He asks about his father's well-being. He asks about his youngest sibling, Benjamin. And he says, "You're spies. Why are you here to spy out the land?" And of course the brothers are pleading with him, No, we're not spies. We're not spies. And he said, "No, but you are spies. And if you're not, I want you to leave. Go get your younger brother Benjamin. Bring him back here. And I want to see if you're telling me the truth about this younger brother that you claim to have." So they go and they journey back, and he gives them some food for the journey. And they bring back Benjamin, and then Joseph's like, "I want Benjamin to stay here. I want Benjamin to stay here." And they go, No, Benjamin's not staying. And so Benjamin goes back with them, and the oldest of the brothers stays behind with Joseph in a jail cell. So the crux of this entire story, brethren, is the revelation of when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And that's found in chapter 45 in verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer restrain himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. They were shocked, they were terrified, and amazed all at the same time when they saw their brother. Verse 4, and Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold in Egypt." So he gives them that little reminder. You sold me into Egypt. But it's not about making them feel bad. He's setting them up for forgiveness. He's setting them up to forgive. Verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sends his people, the children of God, forward into the world to preach life, to preach love, and to spread it around as best you can, be a light on top of a hill not covered by any baskets. To save many. God uses the church to preach the gospel, preach the good news, and to whoever is wanting to listen, to bring them into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Verse 6, for these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the lands of Egypt. Your plans are not better than God's plans. They're not. You might want to go do this and go do that, but in the end, it's just, it's rubbish. It's rubbish. When you look at God's plans for your life, how can you think other things in this world are better or deserving of more of your attention? We should be attentive to the plans of God and the map out of God and the route of God and where he wants us to go, how he wants us to imitate him, how he wants us to look for his glory in things. And that's what Joseph realized. He realized that he didn't want exactly the easy life that he thought he was going to have. All the things that he ever wanted, his father's goods, his father's house, all the things that would have came easy to him if God did not step in and interrupt his plans. What about our plans when they get interrupted? Are we upset about it? Are we mad? When one door closes and another one opens, do you say, but I want door A? You open up door number B. Or, not number, door B. Do we get upset with God when we want something so bad, but it doesn't seem to materialize? Or when we pray for something as hard as we possibly can pray for, but we hear silence. We don't hear anything. But I can assure you that we know that God does hear us, but us in our carnal and our humanity, we don't always see the move of God. We don't always see what God's doing behind the curtain. Kind of like the Wizard of Oz. They didn't know what that man was doing behind the curtain until they opened it up and they saw that it was a man actually who was the wizard. It wasn't actually some creature or some kind of spirit that was doing all of this. But it was really just a man. And in the same way, when God works with humanity, he doesn't need to let us always know his plans that he's doing. Sometimes he keeps us behind the curtain, and we know that the Bible talks about a thin veil that glosses over our eyes, and we can only see a little bit of his glory. He told Moses that you shall not see all of my glory and live. I'll show you my backside. And now is upon the request of Moses saying, show me your glory. Show me your glory. And we need to ask that question of God even today. To remain focused on his plan, show me your glory. Just like Moses did. And of course, overall, God showed us his glory in his Son, who was veiled in human flesh, God the Son. And God showed us his glory in his Son. And we saw his face. So Joseph is weeping here with his brothers, explaining everything that's happened in Egypt thus far, and how God has taken everything that was negative, everything that was evil, everything that was meant for harm, and how God has turned it into good. God has turned it into mercy. God has turned it into life. And even though we see heartache and we see suffering all around, we know that in the end that God is making all things turn for good for those who love him and for those that are called according to his purposes. And we see death, and we see sickness, and we see disease, and we see coronavirus, and we see people in the church passing away to obviously have the Lord hold their memory until that day comes when we resurrect in his kingdom. The Bible says that the spirit goes back to God who gave it. So in a sense, we are going to the Lord because he's holding us. He's keeping us there. He's holding our memory until he gives us our consciousness back during the resurrection. So when we see death, when we see decay, when we see bodies breaking down, we can understand and know that God has the final say in all these things, that God's plan reigns supreme over all the things that we see in this world. Every plan that we see in the world will be tried, will be knocked down, will be kicked down. God will knock down every single wall of opposition that's in his way. And he'll knock down all our walls, and he'll knock down all our plans that are not of his own plans. And he'll bring us into his kingdom, which is the greatest plan. The anguish of his brothers is like the anguish of those who did not hear the word of the Lord today out of the mouths of the saints. The brothers also represent all of Israel when they shall look upon him whom they pierced. The brothers were dismayed, they were upset, they were in anguish, they were crying, they were weeping, just like Israel will weep over the Messiah when they realize that it was him whom they pierced. And this world, we will come up, the people that we've gone into the world with, and they know us, and they know our beliefs, and they know that we have faith in Jesus Christ, and they know that we trust in him for salvation, and they did not believe our word, they did not believe our testimony. They will weep, and they will say, I should have listened. Because now I understand. Now I believe. But they didn't believe, of course, because they heard. They believe now because they see. And Jesus said, blessed are those who have believed without seeing me, that were more blessed. That were more blessed than even those who saw. And the disciples saw him, right? But we believe without ever seeing. Because we believe in their testimony. We believe in the historicity of the Gospels. We believe that their testimony was true and they went to their deaths for it. And we ought to as well. When the brothers found out that Joseph was alive, it was in very many ways reminiscent of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They thought their brother was dead. Right? But God raised up Joseph to a prominent position of power. In the same way God the Father raised up Jesus Christ after his earthly mission, raised him to a prominent place of power at his right hand as the Son of God and man. And that's beautiful. And Joseph showing himself to his brothers. It is I, your brother. And in the same way, Jesus said, peace be to you. It is I. Look here, my hands and my feet. Touch me, for spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see I have. That's a beautiful analogy of the metaphorical, in a sense, resurrection of Joseph to the minds of his brothers, and the very literal resurrection of Jesus Christ and presenting his body to the disciples. Let's look at Genesis chapter 50. Genesis 50 and verse 20. So, after the death of Jacob, his brothers were worried that he would take things out on them now that Jacob was dead. And they're like, oh, Joseph's going to repay us now for all the evil we've done. You see, the world thinks that whenever some evil's done, that they just always expect you to do something evil back to it. But that's not the way that Christians should be. That's not the way followers of God should be. We shouldn't be always looking how to repay somebody for some evil or wicked deed that they might have done. And you see, the brothers are still very fleshly and earthly, and they still don't understand the notion or the idea of forgiveness. They don't understand it. So they expect Joseph now to hate them because there's a circumstance of the father dying. Now, that's in the foreshadow. That's in the shadows now. Jacob died. And now they think that Joseph might kill them for all the sin that they did against him. But I think the crux of the entire story, if you were trying to find the whole meaning of the story of Joseph, I think it's boiled down to this one scripture in verse 20 of chapter 50 of Genesis. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. And that's a beautiful saying. And it reminds me of the scripture that I mentioned before, that God works everything out for good for those that love him and for those that are called according to his purposes. I want to look at Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. Romans 8:28. I just read 28, go down to verse 29. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? So this is the plan of God, that we be conformed to the image and the likeness of his Son, that we be justified by his sacrifice, and that we might be glorified along with him, raising us from the dead to be with him forever. Brethren, we as humans like to have control, right? The whole idea of having our own plans and doing our own thing is about control, ultimately. We like to be in control of our lives. We like to hold a tight-knuckled white fist and force the world to conform to any way we want, and we want to make our own path, and we want to bend it this way and bend it that way. But eventually, because we're human, if we keep bending and bending, if you take a piece of plastic, keep bending it and bending and bending, eventually it'll break. Because we're not meant to make our own plans. We're meant to follow God's plans and follow his lead. And we divert ourselves according to that plan. We either choose to follow it or we choose to leave that plan. But God wants us to stay on that course. He wants us to stay in control of our minds, but give the control of our plan over to Him. Once we can release that control, then it's God who takes over the ship. We can't see over the horizon. We need to remember that we cannot see over the mountain. We cannot see over the horizon. So we can make our plans all we want, but like you saw, there are people within the brethren that died who were here with us 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, a few days ago. If they had planned a year, 2 year, 3 year in advance, well, they're no longer here with us. So we must remember that not everything is promised to us in this world. Tomorrow is not promised to us. We cannot plan far, far ahead into the future thinking that God has to fulfill our plan. Because here's the thing, if God fulfills our plan, then what happens to God's plan? And God's not willing to do that, thankfully. We need to trust in 3 things, brethren. We need to trust in His purposes. Let's turn to Hebrews 2:10 for that. Hebrews 2:10. It reads, "For it was fitting for Him for whom are all things, by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings." That's God's purpose. That's a part of God's plan that interrupts our lives as human beings. To bring many sons to glory. That's the ultimate plan. That's why God created humanity. For God to share just a bit of that glory with us. We will never be God as God is. God is eternal. We are created. But God is able to share that glory with us. He's able to make us sons and daughters of Himself. We hear the term reproducing Himself. God is reproducing Himself in us. Doesn't mean we're equal to Him, but it just means that God wants to share with His people. He wants to share with us. So He will bring many sons to glory. We also need to trust in His love. We can turn to Colossians chapter 1 for that. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13. "He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins." So we trust in God's love because He put into flesh love, and that's Jesus Christ. And God displayed His love through His Son. While Jesus Christ was hanging on the cross, He showed the ultimate form of love when He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That's the ultimate form of love. Praying for your enemies, not hating your enemies. Being there for your enemies. If Jesus Christ can forgive those who nailed Him to the cross, then who are we to hold grudges? Who are we to be envious? Who are we to not like one another or avoid one another? Who are we? We also need to trust in God's mercy. Let's look at Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations 3:22. "Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in him. That's the mercy of God. That we are not consumed because of God's mercy. You see, because when we sin against God, we sin not only against God, but we sin against a holy God. A God of justice, but also a God of love. His love dictates his judgment. Because if he's loving, he'll have a correct judgment. And he cannot be loving if he does not judge, because he has to be a God of justice. But because of his mercy, we're not consumed when we do sin against the holy God. And this is because his compassions fail not. And because he's faithful, and he looks for us to get back up again on the horse and try harder next time and do what's right next time. And we mess up with people. We mess up with friends. We mess up with family. We talk behind each other's back. And we need to do better. God requires of us to do better. Because there's going to be none of that in God's kingdom. That won't be tolerated.